So welcome everyone. This is now our fourth discussion forum based on our Delta Think News and Views series. For those of you who've joined us before, welcome back. We're happy to see you again. And for those of you who are new, we're glad to have you join us today. I'm going to start off with a few introductions. I'm Lori Carlin, Chief Commercial Officer here at Delta Think, and I'll be moderating the session for us today. With me are my colleagues and our News and Views authors, Ann Michael, founder and CEO of Delta Think, and Dan Pollock, our Chief Digital Officer at Delta Think, and along with Ann, an architect of the Delta Think OA data and analytics tool. If you've joined us for a News and Views forum before, then you know we've designed these forums to be very interactive with lots of questions and participation from you all. So I hope you're ready for a lively and informal discussions and have come with your questions ready. A few logistical items before we begin. When you have a question, if you can ask it in the Q&A box, that would be really helpful. We'll be pulling questions from there. As far as structure, we'll have some opening remarks from Ann and from Dan to start off with, and then we'll move into the questions and open discussion after that. Feel free to, in the Q&A, to just add your comments and experiences as well, or in the chat. And just to set expectations, because this is meant to be informal, although we've scheduled an hour for this session today, whether we go the full hour really depends on you. In other words, if there are fewer questions, we may end earlier. So thank you again for joining us, and I will hand off now to Ann to get us started.
Good morning, and again, thank you all for being here. We really do appreciate it. We know there's a lot of things going on. I usually start off with in these sessions by talking a little bit about why we chose this topic. And for this one, it's kind of funny. I could be flip and say, well, we do this every year, and we've done this every year since January of 2017 when Delta Think launched the open access data and analytics tool. But it's a little bit deeper than that too. You know, whether you are on the supply side as a researcher or a publisher, or you're a consumer of research, or both, it's helpful to have a map with some of the pathways or the trends outlined so that you know where you are in relation to the whole. So it's more than simply stating numbers. It's important to highlight the direction of travel and the landscape or potentially the traffic patterns you might encounter along the way. It's also important to understand how the map was created. So what's the true effort, what's true with any effort to analyze data is that data has history and provenance. It matters where it comes from and how it's processed. And so it's important to understand also as you move along, data expands, more data becomes available to us or to others. It might even become better or change in how it's created. And we adjust to that as we should in order to continue to refine our own analyses. So Dan is going to get us started talking a little bit, I promise you, just a little bit about methodology before getting into our headlines. But it's really important that we all have the same context when we interpret these numbers. So Dan, why don't you tell us a little bit about how this gets done, how the sausage is made?
Yeah, absolutely. Morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. So yeah, we combine several data sources. And really the key points are a couple of ones. The first one is every year we run a survey. We reach out to a number of publishers. We always thank you if you happen to be one of those publishers that have participated. Thank you so much for giving us information. We treat that confidentially, but and what that means is we are then able to get a sense of how much revenue and what kind of volume of output people are seeing broken down by major business models. So that's what our survey gives us. It's a sample. And then the second half of that is to scale that sample up into some sort of view of the market overall. And to do that, we look at the index content. In particular, we look at Crossref stroke on paywall. So on paywall, as many of you may know, is a largely automated service that tries and finds out all sorts of published articles and what kind of business models they're published under, open access, hybrid, etc. And that sits on top of Crossref DOIs. So we really use that to give us a sense of the shape of the market and how our sample might scale up. And then we can take a view on that. And then we also throw a few other things into the mix, as it were. So we do look closely at the kind of the major indexes, kind of see how they're scaling, and also sources such as the Open APC project, which is run out of Europe. I think it's by the Max Planck. Max Planck are now effectively running that. They for the last 5 or 6 years now, I think, have been looking at surveys of what various universities have actually paid on a per article basis for their APCs. So that gives us another read on what's going on, and we bring that together and then develop a model to help us project out what we think the market looks like. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the methodology. The headlines, as we put out in our piece recently, we think in 2019 the open access, or the paid for open access market, was worth just over $760 million US, and we think that was up around about 13% or so from 2018. So that's the value. In terms of volume, we think around about 30% of kind of core output is published in open access journals, and we think that 30% volume accounts for roughly 7% of the total scholarly journals market. We think that growth is going to continue quite strongly. So the underlying journals market is growing at kind of 2 to 3% a year, depending on which analyst you ask. We think the value of the open access market is growing considerably quicker than that. So we've put a 3-year CAGR on the value of growing at 11.5%, 2019 through 22. And we think the output, the volume, will grow at about 10.5% over that same period. So it seems that open access is growing quicker than the underlying market, both in terms of volume and value, and is probably taking share. It's becoming an increasingly widely used way of publishing articles, but it is still in the minority, albeit a significant minority. It's not yet the predominant model out there. So Anne, I hope that gives us a sense of both how we've got there and the headline numbers. I know we'll probably start to dive into some of the details behind both of those as we move through.
No, absolutely. And I do think one of the important points to make, and we've made this every year, and it's probably well known to most of the folks out here too, is that obviously the share of article volume versus the share of revenue is very different. So the share of revenue is quite lower than the share of volume. And so that's just an important thing to keep in mind, especially for the publishers that might be out there.
Yeah. Laurie.
So we have a question from our participants to start us off with. Can you talk a little bit more about how transformative agreements fit into this analysis? In particular, how much of the growth in OA is driven by transformative agreements versus other sources?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I absolutely understand why people want to dig into that. I think the very short answer is it's probably too soon to tell just yet. I know transformative agreements and Plan S and that sort of whole conversation has understandably generated a lot of interest. But if you think about them, they are a relatively new phenomenon. I always have to call out the Springer Compact deals, which arguably were a very early form of those agreements, going back, I think, to the late noughties, if memory serves correctly. But in terms of the real sort of whole scale rolling out of them, I think we've really yet to see them being sufficiently prevalent to really start displacing, if you like, other activities. However, I think common sense would suggest they are set to grow. Anne, I don't know if you'd like to.
Yeah, so just the one thing I would add to that is just as to keep in mind that this is a 2019 sizing that is based on data, and beyond 2019 is based on projection. And so I do believe that as we start to get, my personal opinion is that we're going to start to see more of an impact when we're doing sizing for 2021. I think we'll start to see some impact for 2020. Yeah. And what I can say is Dan and I have already started to discuss how we might even adjust our surveys to publishers and our methodology to account for which articles that we are counting that are part of transformative deals. So more to come on that, but not much impact when you look at 2019.
Yeah.
What about other challenges that you might be seeing when you're doing market sizing? What are some of those that you face when you pull together the data and start analyzing it?
I think, I mean, number one is, and as Anne said in her introduction, data continues to change and evolve. So when we started this exercise sort of in 2016, it's a few years ago now, really the only big sources we had available to us were the sort of the indexes. So things like CIMAGO or CWTS, which derive from Scopus, particular example. Fast forward a few years and we've seen on paywall in particular come on stream, which has enabled everyone, I think, to get a much better insight into the balance in output between open access in fully open journals versus open access in hybrid versus other stuff in quotes. And now I believe on paywall is being used in pretty well all the major indexes to help them tease out those ratios. So of course, what that means for us when we develop models and do analysis is we got to think, well, you know, which data source do we use, and more to the point, how do we adopt and evolve our models to take best advantage of the best data available to us. So that's why we tend to run this exercise every year, and we may restate numbers. It also means in the tool itself, it basically means there's more stuff to process, because we actually present two sets of numbers in our tool, because we think that both sort of index sources and, if you like, the on-paywall show market as a whole, they both have very interesting things to tell us about some of the detailed dynamics about especially how volumes of output are changing. So I suggest that's one of the major challenges is just keeping up, if you will, with evolving data. The second one is, and I sort of bang on about this occasionally, is there is a lack of universally adopted and consistently used standards in our marketplace. So we're not like kind of the ad industry that can look at Nielsen ratings, for example. Everybody contributes, that's the kind of industry standard. We don't quite have that equivalent, I think, in scholarly publishing. There are, say, things like Crossref, but people don't necessarily consistently use exactly the same definitions or deposit the same way, or Directory of Open Access Journals, I think, you know, will experience similar challenges. So just getting that consistency of data and figuring out how we compare like for like, I'd suggest is probably another big challenge.
And I would add too that a lot of times when we're starting to evaluate additional or, you know, different data sources, it's the question of how do they map in order to keep that consistent picture so that we're able to extend what we do. And sometimes, you know, that becomes a very interesting. Dan and I oftentimes have debates about, well, we've stated this way. Do we continue to state it that way? Or now that we have something new available to us, do we change? And so we have to make calls on what we do in order to not only make the data and the analysis the most relevant and helpful to, you know, to users in the audience, but also to try to keep some semblance of consistency so that you can look at past data and come up with a reasonable approximation of trends.
Yeah.
Great, thank you both. A couple of follow-up questions. One of which is if you could just, Dan, identify which indices you're talking about here when you refer back to indices.
Yes, I mean, I think I mentioned most of them. On paywall is one of the major sources, as I say, and then we look at they're largely Scopus. So I think Scopus is the core index, but if you go to places like CIMAGO Journal Ranks and CWTS, which is they're the group that I think are spun out of the University of Leiden. They produce the SNP, the Source Normalized Impact per paper, which is what we use when we're looking at citation-based metrics. Those are probably our two major ones. But we also speak to other people. So, for example, we're OASPA. They run a survey every year asking their member organizations to tell them how much stuff they're publishing, and that, especially in the early days, helped give us a read on the balance between fully open access and hybrid, or open access in hybrid. I've mentioned that Open APC, probably not an index as such, but I think that's a very useful data source as well. then we also look at headline readings across others. So I mean, I have to sort of name check, Web of Science is out there, SciLit, produced by MDPI. So there's usually some interesting headline numbers you can find if you go to places like the STM Association biannual report and things like that. That we can also use to sense check what we're doing.
And I just want to add one thing to that too. What's really interesting about that is that, like now, for example, one of those questions that we're working on right now is, once we've looked at on paywall, there's also information about articles in there that aren't necessarily indexed in what we would consider a classic index. So we're at the point now where we're considering, do we state our numbers as we've done in the past based on these more common indexes, or do we now expand to say, well, there's a whole lot of content that we're seeing that isn't in these indexed, in these indexes. And, I think we've settled on where we're going to do both, but it's an interesting point. So every time more data becomes available, we have to think about how to meaningfully incorporate it.
Yeah. And they provide different answers. So, for example, over the summer, I think Jason Priam from Paywall released a tweet saying that 53% of 2019 output was published open access. And I'd given this talk a couple of times. If you start to then drill into those numbers, Jason's absolutely sort of accurate, if you will, based on the broadest definition, if you will, of open, which is what Paywall is looking at, because Paywall want to direct people to find free to read articles. But not everybody would consider their definition to be capital O open access, because the formal definition of open access is articles that are both free to read, but also free to reuse. So as we then drill into the data, we find that 50% starts to go down. And if you look at the proportion of articles that are sort of reusable under some sort of open license, that 50% probably goes down to nearer 40%. If you focus in on stuff that's sitting in the major indexes, that's probably nearer 30%. And the significance of the major indexes is it does represent, I think, a core chunk of the market. And more importantly, we can then pull that apart and have a look at different subjects and disciplines. But then as you further go into the data, if, for example, you are a social scientist, you find within social scientists, maybe open access content is well under 20% of output, maybe 16, 17%. So that's the other challenge with the data. It really does depend on the context of your question and what you as an organization are seeking to find out, and where you see you're operating. And different organizations will operate in different bits of the market. So quite often when we do custom work or tailor-made work, the first conversations we have with people are basically, well, how do you see yourself? Which bit of the market you're operating in? And then that helps us zone in on the right data or the right subset of data to provide what we think would be the most relevant answers to people's particular questions.
Great, thank you. So we have really, this one's a statement, but I'm curious what your thoughts are going forward, whether this will be a challenge or how we see this. And the statement was, I hope you can track the numbers around license types, subscribe to open, wrap, PAR, community support, because that would be useful in local conversations at libraries. So, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll start with that one, actually. It's very interesting. We've also had a lot of conversations around different kinds of open access licenses and how we would break them out, especially since funders are now saying that something isn't necessarily in compliance unless it's in a more broad use or permissive, and we're still working on language license. So we are definitely starting to do that. I think that statement might have come from my previous statement about how we're looking into the future, about how we're going to specifically get into wrap and PAR deals. But the idea of breaking out licenses is something that we're working on right now to be able to present that within the open access tool. Dan, did you want to add to that?
No, that's it. It's something I have some early numbers already. I'm not going to present them here because we want to double check them. But yeah, absolutely. That balance between CC0 stroke CCBY, which tends to sit in if you like the classic funder mandates, versus shareable under some, but with some sort of restriction, CC, non-commercial or non-derivative or publisher-specific licenses. So there's kind of two buckets of content, and we are separating the open access segment out into those two. And then further, we plan to split fully open access and hybrid, so we can see if there's any different dynamics, because I suspect there may well be a different emphasis in license depending on whether you are a fully open access publisher or a publisher in a fully open access journal versus the open access uptake in hybrid. So yeah, that will be coming to ATOL very soon.
So stay tuned. So we have another question here. There's a lot of innovation, disruption, and experimentation with business models, and we've just talked about a few of them. What effect does this have on publishers' workflows and then, of course, their margins related to that?
Actually, I might start on this one too, Dan.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
This is a very interesting question. So, and I guess it depends on where you're starting from. So, for example, as someone who has was previously spent, most of the last year with PLOS, I can tell you that from a business model, going from an APC individual payment model to a business model where there was more reliance and interaction with institutions and institutional sales, if you will, or deals, and the collective action, community action program that they've put together, that's a very big impact in PLOS on workflows. It's, first of all, there have always been things like membership agreements where maybe some institution got a discount on their APCs, but they were still counting APCs, and there was still this APC to author, relationship to institution relationship. And what's interesting about a lot of the models that we're talking about now, when you think about collective action, the PLOS community action, or others, if you were a traditional mixed model publisher, well, you had a lot of those mechanisms in place to manage institutions. You already had, as a matter of fact, one of the initial pluses of the subscribe to open model for annual reviews, if you've ever heard anyone speak about it, was that it leveraged the existing infrastructure. But when you're a fully open access person, organization, you don't necessarily have that infrastructure in place to for that market. So there was a lot of work that we were doing around business development, sales, just, community action and getting institutions involved, working with consortia. Then there was also the other side of how do we bill for this and how do we count this in the PLOS model. One particular thing was this all you can eat model, where now there was, as long as you were a member and taking part, your folks from your institution could publish as much as they want. So that payment to APC perspective is not exactly the same. So I would say that the biggest things that I see as far as impact to workflows would be for the fully open folks that are looking at now building up an institutional and consortia capability. For the traditional publishers or the mixed model publishers, I think that they're able to leverage what they have. They basically, from their finance, I'm sure they're having to make changes, but I don't know if their workflow changes all that much as far as, what they have to tell an author when they're accepted or things of that nature. There have been other integrations that I've seen with the manuscript tracking tools, regardless of what type of publisher you are, where most of the people that are working on this are trying to make it very clear to the author as early as possible what they're entitled to. So you have things like CCC and like Chronos Hub, and Aptara has a product where they're trying now to also tell you right at acceptance, if you tell us your affiliation, and often they use Ringgold or Grid or some of those IDs for disambiguation of institutions, and they'll say, well, this is what you would have to pay for an open access option, or nothing, which could be zero. So, I mean, I don't know, Dan, if you have anything to add to that, but that's kind of what I've seen the most of.
I think more on that. So the recent Basel Sustainable Publishing Forums earlier this week was a couple of speakers mentioned this, and I think the challenge is almost there in the question. We're currently working through a lot of change, and on the buy side, as it were, within institutions, we're seeing increasingly, of course, libraries and faculties needing to come together, because especially as these joint deals come out, you're dipping into what have historically been separate budget pots. So there's a kind of sense of change on that end. And then from a publisher's perspective, every institution, every funder has a slightly different nuance. And of course, publishers need to adapt to that complexity. And ideally get to a point where an author can come in and be offered with a sort of fairly simple yes or no answer. So I think in the short term, the complexity is going to increase and costs will therefore increase, and margin then becomes a matter of how well you manage that. Also compare with how smart you are on your pricing. The analogy I tend to use here, and apologies to those who've heard me bang on about this before, is if you go back to the early days of the motor car, it used to be every single motor car was operated differently. So everybody's heard of a Model T Ford. You can even go out and hire a Model T Ford out in California. Good luck to you driving it, because the gas pedal's a little lever on the steering wheel. The center pedal doesn't do brakes. It's something to do with making you go faster. So in the early days of the motor car, there was as many different ways of driving motor cars as there was models of motor car. It was really only in the kind of late 20s, I think early 30s, that we alighted on the standard setup we now have today. Gas pedal on the right, brake pedal in the middle, and maybe if you're driving stick or you've got a manual transmission, you've got that clutch pedal on the left. That standard evolved over time, and that probably took about 40 odd years to arrive after the motor car's invention. I'm not suggesting we'll necessarily be that slow with different publishing models, but I think it makes the point. We're likely, I think, eventually to converge to some standards, and we'll see fewer models and probably a coming together of that. But that's, I still think, in the future. I think we're still working our way through that experimental phase and kind of finding where best to place the gas pedal. We're still working on it. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, and that's kind of interesting too, because I guess you could look at this question a couple of different ways. So I was specifically thinking about the models that we've seen, the RAP and PAR models, the different forms of collective action, whether it's subscribe to open or the PLOS community model or some of the other models that are out there. And in some ways, those models, they may increase complexity, or in some cases, they don't really increase complexity all that much. But I think you open us up to a really interesting point, which is that's what we're seeing right now. So as we continue to experiment with models, I think one thing that's pretty clear is that the APC has been the predominant model of open access, from the beginning. And there are a lot of people finding, deficiencies in that particular model. So we're going to see more experimentation, and it's the experimentation itself that's going to drive cost in the short term. But I do think in the long term, when you think about it, APCs is a B2C model almost. Yes, there are intermediaries, more so in the UK and Europe than in the US. There are fewer intermediaries in the US. What we're seeing is the US is starting to develop that intermediary market where institutions, are paying on behalf of their researchers. But I actually think a B2B model might ultimately lower the complexity.
Yeah, I mean, because I think that's what we're seeing with some of these, PAR deals. They tend to operate at scale at a country or funder institution level. I think absolutely. And actually, talking of innovation, and Anne and I were talking about this previously. The other innovation is in what we call things. So, for example, when we talk about subscriptions, I think most people at the moment would infer, take that to mean that we're talking about subscribe to access, as opposed to that kind of transactional APC, which is a payment to publish. However, as you get these joint deals, and I know organizations like PLOS are also working on subscribe to publish models, if that is the right language. So one of my questions, I'd be quite interested to hear what people throw into the chat about this, is how should we refer to a subscription model that is a subscribe, bundle of APCs, a sort of pay forward APC model? And does that mean that subscription, as we've taken it to mean, is that language going to have a different meaning now, or are we going to use different language?
Well, I think it's really careful that we think about that to begin with. It used to mean years ago that publish meant print. But the reality was that was just the mechanism that was available to publish for a long, long, long time, until we get into the early 90s. And now I think you're right. I think subscription tends in many circles to mean that you're subscribing to get past a paywall to get access to something. And that is not necessarily what it's going to evolve to mean. So it's time to, to separate that. What subscription is a model. It's a, and when you talk to some of the experts, like we had Rain Crow on last webinar with Sarah Rui from PLOS, now you're talking about, more of a preference of an all you can eat kind of a model too, where yes, there is a subscription paid to publish, but there's also this aspect of collective action, which is it's a subscribe to consume model, where that gets really tricky. And you could go back and look at our last webinar, because I think Rain went through this pretty well, is that if you don't reserve some kind of a benefit for the reader that is not access, but is something else, then you get to the point where why would someone pay that subscription if they're not publishing? So the early hard driver is to go for the people that are publishing and to work a subscription model around them.
Makes sense. To go back now, we had a question on Twitter earlier around the growth rate in open access and the fact that we're seeing these falling numbers in terms of previous years, and will this fall over the coming years? Any evidence that output and or revenue of non-OA is decreasing?
Yeah, because I think the question was about non-open access.
Yes.
The short answer is no, revenue or output. So we are publishing more and more and more stuff. I think we always should attach a caveat to that of course we may be getting slightly better at finding the more stuff. So some of the automated indexing on paywall, maybe people like Dimensions, as they improve their algorithms, they may be getting more sophisticated, kind of rooting out stuff, or we're increasingly including.
And metadata could be getting better too, Dan.
Yeah, exactly. As people start to wrap their heads around that. But I think even controlling that out, we continue to produce more stuff. I think it's always been thus. The classic discussion around the old serials crisis or current serials crisis, depending on your perspective. There's always been more stuff published every year. So total output increases, which then means you can increase open access output and open access as a share of it. But if the total amount's going up anyway, even the kind of the non-open access bit can continue to grow. So I think we're seeing that. Really the difference is the growth rate, especially of non-open access volume, is slowing down a bit. So not growing quite as quickly as the overall market as sort of open access starts to make headway into it. But I think absolutely there's no sign of any shrinking. We continue to produce more stuff and publish more stuff, and I'm not sure that's likely to change anytime soon.
So Dan will probably want to shoot me for this, but we were contemplating. This is not an answered question, more like a mental puzzle. Could we answer the question: is how much is open access contributing to overall growth versus simply moving from a more traditional subscription, as we've traditionally described, subscription for access model to open? And so we're playing around with that. Like if you think about it, for example, years ago before PLOS One and then scientific reports, there was not a sound science model for publishing as something. Negative results was not something that was necessarily pushed as broadly. So one could argue potentially, although we'd need to put numbers on it, and we're not really sure how we would do that yet. So again, this is just a kind of fun thing. Yes, it's fun for us to think about. It could be that there might be a small increase in overall amount of publications that actually is due to open access venues.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the sound science example is a really good one because it just didn't exist before. So we could argue that's a genuine increase, but equally we're seeing this, I think, especially since Plan S has really bitten, that love it or hate it, it's reinvigorated the conversation about a move to fully open models. And I think, a lot of organizations are now really looking at this. So inevitably, the market's going to shift. So in that sense, there'll be an element of, quote, cannibalization, in other words, movement from one to the other. I suspect, as with all of these things, the answer will be the truth lies somewhere in between the two extremes.
Right. And actually, Dan, we don't, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if something is a preprint but isn't actually been published within an index journal or a journal, we're not counting that as size. Now, remember, market sizing
Correct.
is about revenue and about volume, and preprints at this point are not revenue producing.
So we take the data in. So if somebody came to us and said, can you sort of give us a view on what's happening within the preprint world? Yes, we could probably do that. But absolutely right. For the purposes of sizing and this sort of stuff, no, it's got to be sitting on a publisher's platform, and we set aside the submitted articles basically on paywall. Every DOI looks at it, will classify it as, is it a submitted, an accepted, or a published article. Largely the submissions are sitting in repositories only, so they kind of naturally sit in a separate bucket, but we tend to look at the stuff that would trigger an APC. Right. So absolutely we set that aside. But yeah, then that opens up the whole conversation of the increased use of preprint servers, which we've previously explored, and at some point, we're beginning to see those overlay models where people might look at effectively a preprint server and then start to add kind of some sort of review or peer review on top of that. And that's a whole...
Right, at what point is that like platinum OA?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So moving into the issue of the year, in this weird time that we're in 2020 and with COVID, and then adding on top of that, just general scholarly publishing sector changes that are going on, either related to that or completely unrelated to that. What impact do you see these changes having on future analysis? And there's so many different tentacles that we can talk about when it comes to these potential changes. So I open that up for broad discussion.
Yes, it's the crystal ball question, as I like to frame it. It's so I mean, I'll go first then and chip in. And I think we have explored this in a previous webinar. We put some pieces out on this. So we know that in the wake of COVID-19, especially, we've seen an increase in preprints and the whole push to try and get, quote, science out quickly, unquote. I think it is too soon to tell if that increased spike, however you want to call it, in preprints will translate into publications. What we do know, of course, is it really challenges publishers, especially those publishers sitting in relevant fields, because they've got a lot more stuff they've got to go through. How that will translate, of course, into peer-reviewed output, I think is probably too soon to tell. So there's that immediate workflow challenge. And then I was just the other kind of COVID-19 impact, and again, we have to wait and see on this one, is the effect of funding and budget cuts. Inevitably, as governments have had to offer support, lesser or greater, whatever the politics, as they've had to support industries and output in the wake of COVID. And as we see gross domestic product, GDP, fall, which I think all the analysts will agree on, that means the amount of money left over to invest, particularly in the academic sector, which is where a lot of scholarly research output comes from, that amount of money is going to shrink. And that inevitably means we think there's likely to be budget cuts on the horizon. And I think it's worth adding, especially with our sort of forward-looking market projections, we develop mathematical models, and the maths, or the maths, depending on which side of the Atlantic you are, the mathematics can't predict these kind of step change events like COVID. That really is, we're going to have to wait and see what especially our survey data, I think, comes back with, to see what that will look like. So we can sort of say, well, we think the trends are in a particular direction, all things being equal. But I think it would, it is likely that COVID is going to cause some sort of disruption, I think, even into the normally resilient scholarly publishing industry. Details to follow. Anne, I'll
just adding to that. So preprints aside, what I can say anecdotally is I've spoken to at more than a half a dozen publishers, some of whom have actually publicly talked about this, like the AMA, who have received a whole lot more submissions. I mean, I think the AMA figure, and we can put the link in the chat, was something like 3 times what they normally receive. Now, of course, you would say, all right, well, that's medicine and there's COVID. So of course the medical titles might be increasing, but this has happened in scientific titles and non-bio, not non-bioscience titles as well. And a lot of the assumption, and anecdotally what people are saying is that when we got into lockdown, researchers who were unable to get in their labs started to work through content, and research that they had done and not necessarily written up, and started to produce their research from those sources. What's been interesting is that when you talk to folks back in March and April and May, as this phenomenon was happening, and I can tell you PLOS also got a huge influx across titles of different research, of more submissions than usual. What we all expected that, well, this is going to stop. So what's going to happen is that drawer is going to be empty at some point. And if labs aren't opened again, if research facilities are not open again, that this is going to be a problem. So far, everybody expecting a drop-off has not experienced that drop-off yet. So is it because there's still more? Or is it because, there's new research being done, they've figured out ways around it? And, it would be interesting to kind of look into that. So I do think, Dan, the one thing, so when we look at, in the future, when we look at next year, when we're sizing 2020, I do think that there are some anomalies that we're going to have to think about. And some of the funding anomalies may not actually be present until after that. So another very interesting thing to think about is that usually for a mixed model publisher or someone with a classically defined subscription for access kind of a model, those deals are multi-year deals normally. And so there's only maybe, let's just say a third, if it's a 3-year deal, there's only a portion of those deals that come up for renewal every year. So it's going to take a few years to see the full impact of budget changes on those deals. The other thing that I think is interesting is I do think that we might see an acceleration to read and publish and read deals for 2 reasons. One is that if you are a library and you're locked into a multi-year deal with someone, it might behoove you to say, let's do a read and publish deal or publish and read deal now, because it might actually recast. Someone might be open to a contract renegotiation earlier than you would have had one done, and that might help you with your budgeting. So I just think that, preprints is interesting to watch. All of these transformative agreements, I think they're going to really hit later, but they're starting. And then this kind of weird surge from COVID that was not expected. And one last note about the surge is that I will say almost everyone except for one of the folks that I've talked to have experienced lower than normal acceptance rates on this surge of content. So that's an interesting thing. It hasn't necessarily translated into part of an APC type of a model cash flow. But it will be really interesting, Dan. I have a feeling that next fall it's going to be a lot of fun.
Do the people you speak to have a sense of why kind of submissions have gone up, acceptance has gone down? Does that mean the kind of submissions maybe aren't quite as high quality as they used to be, or playing devil's advocate slightly?
It's hard to say across the board, but in some cases, I do think that it's a quality issue. Now, quality doesn't necessarily always mean bad research. It might mean quality in the sense of it's very narrow research, or, so quality is, I don't like that word because there's so much that's in there that.
So they could have been slightly
that has
off
nothing to do
scope
with quality, right? So I don't want to be ever picking on someone's life's work, but it might be, let's call it fit.
Closeness to criteria. So let's put it like that.
We have a question actually that came through on the chat, and it's just really a broad question about advice for publishers, and maybe in context of now, really what's going on in the industry and in the world, for an organization that is looking to launch a new OA title. in this current environment? You know, what should they be thinking about? How should they be preparing? What kind of research might they do?
I'll start off with the data bit, and I don't know if you want to get into some more of the process stuff. So I think in terms of research, it's a case of looking at the sorts of patterns in the market, especially I think volumes of output. We do quite a bit of work modeling this for people and say, okay, for my discipline and for my niche in the market, you know, do I want to launch a really high impact, highly cited journal? If I'm am I looking at operating a different slice of the marketplace? So thinking about kind of what your core proposition is, to use a phrase, and then you can use the data to get a sense, okay, well, how are the trends tracking in that? So for example, my example about social sciences, you know, social sciences, the sort of the classic APC model, I think a lot of people find is less relevant and indeed can be quite challenging if you're a social sciences publisher. So the dynamics for you in that situation may be different if you're a life sciences publisher or so on. So just drilling into the data, looking at the sort of trends, and then you can start to model out, okay, so what might that mean for me in terms of what's the prospect for submissions and therefore ultimately the kind of revenues I need to generate. And then of course you need to look at the cost side of things as well, and that will get you into, you know, your systems. And started, you know, spoke about this earlier. Have you got an existing publishing program? How much of your tools and processes can you readily adapt or reuse versus starting from new? So I think it's, you know, that sort of thing. I mean, Anne, I've started with a shopping list.
I guess, you know, I would almost take this question and break it into a couple of different parts. Like, so for example, if you are currently publishing and, you know, if you have a program, one of the first things that I would look at too, in addition to the market trends and the trends specific to your discipline, would also be, what do you publish? What do you reject? Where does what you reject go? So that's you know, a very basic thing, and lots of you know, that data is available through various.
And where does what you publish come from? Where do your submissions come from as well?
Right. So breaking it down, you know, where are you getting submissions? But you know, but the point about where your publications, you know, where things go is that if you find that you're rejecting articles that wind up not only getting published but getting published to open access, that could be showing that you have an opportunity to offer that service to those authors as well, you know, in some new journal or whatnot, depending on how the subjects line up. The other thing that's really important to think about too, depending again on where you are, if you are a publisher and you don't have, if your only open access is a hybrid option, you have to start thinking about a fully open access journal. You need to think about your cost structure. So you may not just want to bolt on open access to the processes that you have now. You have to really think about, you know, what functions do you want your editorial folks to be doing? What functions do you want to provide? What's the service level that you want to provide in relation to this open access journal? Because the way for you to keep your APC, if you are talking about an APC model, so let's make that assumption as well, the way to keep that manageable is to manage the cost structure. And very often what we find is organizations that even with a hybrid model, the hybrid model open access tends to be exactly the same process for the most part as the subscription, the paywalled access articles that would go through that process would be exposed to. And so therefore the cost structure is the same. And when you're talking about an open access model, you really have to be real careful about thinking about your cost structure. The other thing you need to think about, and Lori could probably speak a ton to this, is it's a way different prospect to be marketing and you know, an open access journal, to be you're marketing to authors. And yes, to some extent you do that in every journal. Every editor is trying to get the best things submitted to their journal, of course, regardless of the business model. But with open access, you're actually trying to find the people that are interested in open access, that want to publish open access, that are in your discipline, maybe that have published open access before, and you're trying to show them the benefits of publishing in your open access journal. And I think when you devote dollars to marketing, you need to account for that, especially in the first few years.
Yeah, and you may even be trying to educate in certain areas of the world about open access on top of just marketing for the papers, and overcoming some preconceived notions as well, for sure. Okay. I'm going to ask you both if you have any closing statements before we wrap up today. Anything more you'd like to say before we close out? Dan's good.
I think I'm good. Thank you.
No, not really. Again, I just really appreciate everyone coming. And if you have other questions, even after today, feel free to email us, or the market sizing information is also on the Delta Think blog. So you could certainly just go leave a comment or something if you have a question. And again, just thanks for being here.
Yeah. So that's a wrap for our session today. And thank you, Anne and Dan, for a great session again today. We'll be sharing a recorded version of the session on our website probably in a few days, if not sooner, and you'll receive a notification when it's available, so you can listen again if you want to, or share it with your colleagues. And as Anne said, if anything occurs to you and you'd like to discuss further after today, please feel free to email us. And lastly, watch for word of our next discussion forum, likely in early 2021. And we look forward to chatting with you again. So stay healthy, everyone, and take care.
Right.
Bye.